The Architect of Annihilation, the tragic true story of America's first serial killer. The Gilded Grin and the Coming Fair. The White City Shadow. The year is 1893. America has erected a monument to its boundless ambition, a gleaming metropolis of pure classical architecture rising from the swamplands of Chicago, the world's Columbian Exposition. It is the dazzling White City, a beacon of progress and a promise of the future. But just outside its luminous gates and the soot-stained streets of Inglewood, a different kind of architecture is quietly taking shape. A place of hidden passages, soundproof chambers, and doors that lock from the outside. It is a structure of pure, calculated evil, and its architect wears the most charming smile in the city. In the heart of the Gilded Age, amidst the intoxicating fumes of progress and prosperity, stood Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, or simply H.H. Holmes, a man whose life was a masterpiece of fabrication. He was a physician without a practice, a husband to several women, a businessman with endless schemes, and a connoisseur of human frailty. He stood on the corner of South 63rd Street and Wallace Avenue, his gaze fixed on the monstrosity he had built. Not a traditional monstrosity, but a 3-story block-long building of commercial storefronts and apartments, hastily constructed with a facade of respectability. To the unknowing, it was the World's Fair Hotel, ready to welcome the flood of tourists arriving for the fair. To its creator, it was something far grander, far darker. His laboratory, his sanctuary, his machine. Holmes was a figure of deceptive elegance. His mustache was neatly trimmed, his vest immaculate. His eyes, a striking pale blue intensity, held an unnerving yet compelling intensity. He moved with the smooth, self-assured grace of a man who held a secret, a man who understood that in the new booming urban landscape, anonymity was the ultimate weapon. In Chicago, 1,000 new faces arrived daily, all chasing the promise of the White City. A new face could arrive, flourish, and vanish, and the city's indifferent sprawl would swallow the record whole. This was the core of Holmes' genius. He built his career on the willingness of people to believe him. "A grand undertaking, Doctor," a passing acquaintance, Mr. Miller, remarked, tipping his bowler hat. Miller was a hardware supplier who'd been surprisingly and repeatedly paid in full by the fast-talking doctor, despite the sheer complexity of the building's design. Holmes turned, his smile immediate and disarming. "Ah, Miller. Indeed, we must be ready for the crush. Every room in Chicago will be full by May. My little establishment here will be a welcome respite from the crowds." He didn't elaborate on the kind of respite it would offer. The building itself was a riddle set in brick. The construction was a nightmare of constant starts and stops, of furious arguments with contractors, and of workmen who were hired, confused by the plans, and then swiftly fired, often without pay, before they could decipher the building's internal logic. The architecture was intentionally bizarre. Staircases that led to nowhere, doors opening to blank brick walls, rooms without windows, doors that only locked from the outside. It was a labyrinth designed not to confuse an outsider, but to disorient the person inside, ensuring their fate was sealed before they realized they were trapped. Holmes ran his hand over the brickwork, his smile thinning to a line of cold satisfaction. He had incorporated the latest technological advancements of the age, gas lines, electricity, ventilation shafts, but twisted them to a singular, sinister purpose. The soundproof vaults on the second floor weren't for storing valuables. They were for containing screams. The large custom-built kiln in the basement wasn't for firing pottery. It was for disposal. He wasn't merely building a hotel. He was constructing an engine of death, finely tuned to the rhythms of the 1893 World's Fair. The fair promised a river of fresh, hopeful, and untraceable victims. women from small towns with a modest inheritance, drifters looking for work, young men lured by the sparkle of a new life. They would arrive, check in, and disappear into the endless thrilling churn of Chicago, their absence merely a footnote in the grand celebration of American progress. This was the truth beneath the polished veneer of Dr. H. Holmes. He was a predator of the new era, one who hunted with charm, paperwork, and the overwhelming, impersonal power of the modern city. The White City shone, a glorious lie, but its true cost would be paid in the deep shadows of the murder castle. The roots of the serpent. The man known as H. Holmes began life not as a sophisticated con artist in a bustling metropolis, but as Herman Webster Mudgett in the isolated, rigid confines of Gilmanton, New Hampshire. Born in 1861, his childhood was a stark contrast to the dazzling image he later projected. His family was affluent, steeped in the strict, unyielding piety of New England Methodism. His father, Levi Horton Mudgett, was a severe, often abusive man, whose discipline bordered on cruelty. Herman learned early that appearance was everything. The outward presentation of virtue was more important than the reality. He cultivated a quiet, intense intelligence, coupled with the deep-seated contempt for authority and a chilling curiosity about the body. The local accounts were sparse but persistent. Tales of Herman trapping small woodland creatures, rabbits, squirrels, and conducting crude amateur surgeries on them, dissecting them not in a spirit of discovery, but with the detached, methodical coldness. Later, an incident in a doctor's office where classmates, bullying the smart, reclusive boy, forced him to touch a human skeleton would become a chilling anecdote in his own twisted narrative. Rather than being repulsed, the young Herman felt the morbid fascination bloom. He escaped the stifling air of Gilmanton by seeking a medical education, a choice that proved pivotal. He enrolled in the University of Michigan Medical School, a period where his predatory inclinations began to fully manifest, largely focused on financial gain. He was a mediocre student, but a brilliant schemer. He took out insurance policies on individuals who didn't exist, procured cadavers, sometimes through grave robbing, sometimes through less conventional means, mutilated them, and staged accidents to collect the insurance money. For Herman, the human body was merely a resource, a commodity to be exploited, and his medical knowledge was the key to maximizing its value. In 1878, he married Clara Lovering, the daughter of a rich farmer, a union of financial convenience that quickly soured. Leaving Clara and their child behind, Herman began his life as a perpetual fugitive, shedding wives, debts, and identities with the ease of a snake shedding skin. The name H. Holmes was born of this flight. The name change served two purposes: to evade the legal repercussions of his numerous frauds and bigamous marriages, and to adopt an air of sophistication. It was a clear homage to the literary figure Sherlock Holmes, a testament to Herman's own elevated view of his intellect. In 1886, he arrived in Chicago, and the sprawling, chaotic, morally ambiguous city was a perfect incubator for his true self. He took a job at a drugstore in the Inglewood neighborhood, owned by an older woman named Elizabeth S. Houghton. Within a year, through a mixture of charm, subtle pressure, and financial manipulation, Holmes gained full ownership of the store. Mrs. Houghton, who had lived on the premises, soon vanished, her disappearance quietly explained away by Holmes as a sudden decision to visit family in California. She was likely his first victim in Chicago, a test of his method that confirmed his ultimate power, the power of disappearance. With the pharmacy secured and the World's Fair looming, Holmes now possessed both the motive and the means. He was in desperate need of money to fund his increasingly opulent lifestyle and to settle debts. The fair was an impending storm of humanity, and he would build his ark to capture them. On the empty lot across from the drugstore, the plans for the murder castle were drafted, meticulously designed by the doctor's own dark mind. The foundation was laid not on concrete, but on a mounting pile of lies, abandoned women, and the silent, unpunished crime of Mrs. Holton. The serpent had found its den, and the stage was set for the darkest chapter in American criminal history. The castle takes shape. The construction of the building, often referred to as the castle in hushed whispers years later, was a marvel of purposeful inefficiency and structural madness. It was not built to code, but to a chilling internal logic. Holmes had an uncanny ability to charm or deceive all who came into his orbit, but he also had a deeply ingrained distrust of everyone, especially those who held the keys to his secrets. To ensure no single person could understand the building's true floor plan, he employed a dizzying array of contractors, hiring and firing them in rapid succession. A carpenter would build a wall, only for the next team to knock it down and rebuild it a few feet over,
creating a series of misaligned rooms and false passages. Plumbers installed pipes that led nowhere, and gas lines that snaked through hidden panels in the walls. The constant turnover of labor kept anyone from putting the jigsaw puzzle together. A foreman might lay the foundation for a perfectly normal apartment, only to be replaced by a bricklayer who was instructed to set the walls at odd angles, creating wedge-shaped rooms that no sensible architect would design. The ground floor was initially his expanded pharmacy, a respectable front that masked the horrors above. The upper floors were where the true work of the architect of annihilation took place. The second floor was a honeycomb of nearly 50 rooms, many of which were small, oddly shaped, and lacked any logical arrangement. The corridors were a maze, designed to ensure a lost guest would only stumble further into the trap. There were blind shafts, chutes disguised as air ducts that dropped straight to the basement, and a series of airtight vaults, lined with iron plates and asbestos, complete with gas jets that could be activated from a small closet outside the room. Holmes, the self-proclaimed doctor, had created a chamber for asphyxiation, a place where he could listen from the closet as the oxygen slowly depleted, observing his victim's final, silent struggle through a hidden peephole. The basement, the dark heart of the castle, was his surgical theater and disposal unit. It was equipped with vats of acid, quick lime pits, and the massive kiln, all ready to dissolve and incinerate the evidence. He installed a dissection table, anticipating his future experiments. His medical background had taught him how to work with human remains. His financial need gave him the motive. The bones could be stripped clean, processed, and then sold to medical schools, turning murder into a profit-generating enterprise. As the building neared completion in the autumn of 1892, Holmes needed capital, and he needed a victim to test the building's efficiency. He found both in the form of Julia Connor and her young daughter, Pearl. Julia, a petite, quiet woman, was the wife of Ned Connor, a successful jeweler whose shop was located inside Holmes' building. Ned was a decent, hard-working man, but Holmes, sensing a weakness, had easily seduced Julia. He had the kind of relentless, hypnotic focus that few women of the era, starved for excitement and attention, could resist. Ned, unable to compete with the doctor's charm and apparent wealth, eventually abandoned his wife and daughter, leaving them in Holmes's care. He never suspected the terrifying truth that he had signed his family's death warrant. Julia was a beautiful woman, but she was also a problem. She knew too much about the pharmacy's dubious finances and had become an inconvenient impediment to Holmes's new plans. She had also fallen pregnant with his child. On the eve of Christmas 1891, the unthinkable happened. Holmes, perhaps under the pretense of performing an abortion, or simply by luring her into one of his soundproofed rooms, murdered Julia. The accounts are murky, but the result was clear. Julia Connor vanished, swallowed by the castle. A short time later, her 10-year-old daughter Pearl, a bright, innocent child, also disappeared. The two were the first of the castle's ghosts, their bodies likely dissolved in the basement's pits or incinerated in the kiln. Their disappearance was a sickening success for Holmes. Ned Connor, though heartbroken, assumed they had simply run off. The city was too busy preparing for the great fair to notice the quiet elimination of a jeweler's wife and his daughter. the castle was operational. H. Holmes had secured his lair, proved his method, and was ready for the millions of unsuspecting visitors who would soon flock to the gates of the White City. His empire of annihilation was ready to open for business.
The Devil in the White City. The influx of the innocents. The year 1893 arrived, and with it, the glorious dawn of the world's Columbian Exposition. The White City was a breathtaking spectacle of electric lights, pristine plaster, and roaring innovation. For 6 months, millions of visitors flocked to Chicago, drawn by the promise of marvels, the enormous Ferris wheel, the exotic dances of the Midway Plaisance, and the sheer audacity of American industrial power. This dense, swirling population was a hunter's dream. The air was thick with optimism, opportunity, and the vulnerability of people far from home, clutching their life savings and their hopes. They came from small towns in Iowa, from farms in Kansas, from distant cities, all eager to lose themselves in the grandeur of the fair. And many of them, tired and trusting, sought cheap lodging in the neighborhood of Englewood, just blocks from the fairgrounds. The sign above H. Holmes's building now read, "The World's Fair Hotel." It was the perfect disguise. Holmes, the proprietor, was at his peak. He had refined his persona to an art form, a charming, generous doctor, quick with a compliment and an offer of work, a room, or even marriage. He focused his attention almost exclusively on women, young, single, with money, or ideally an inheritance that could be easily liquidated. They were targets of opportunity, arriving alone, with no local ties, and often desperate to believe in the promise of a man like Holmes. One such victim was Emmeline Sigrand, a beautiful, intelligent stenographer who came to Chicago from Indianapolis seeking secretarial work. Holmes immediately offered her a position as a personal assistant, along with a room in the hotel. He captivated her with talk of his grand schemes and his supposed wealth. Emmeline quickly fell under his spell. Another was Minnie Williams, a wealthy young woman from Texas who had inherited significant property. Holmes, ever the bigamist, courted and swiftly married her, legally taking control of her assets, including a valuable property in Fort Worth. Minnie had a sister, Nanny Williams, who was naturally curious about her new brother-in-law and came to visit. These women became part of Holmes's inner circle, sometimes living in separate parts of the castle, sometimes unaware of one another's existence. He was a master of compartmentalization, weaving elaborate conflicting lies to keep his stories straight. He used his charm to isolate them, convincing them to sign over their insurance policies or deposit their funds in accounts he controlled. Life inside the Labyrinth. The daily routine within the World's Fair Hotel was a chilling dance of deception. Tourists unaware of the building's deeper secrets stayed in the normal rentable rooms on the first and third floors. They complained about the odd layout, the strange muffled noises, and the pervasive chemical smell that Holmes explained away as disinfectants for the pharmacy. But for the women in his inner circle, the experience was markedly different. They were housed in rooms strategically located near the secret passages, the vaults, and the gravity chutes. Holmes kept them close, always under surveillance, but separated. He would often invite his current victim into his private office, a lavishly furnished room on the second floor, designed to convey respectability and success. This room, however, contained the master controls for the castle. From behind his desk, with a smooth flip of a switch or the silent turning of a gas cock, Holmes could activate the gas jets in the soundproof rooms, plunging his victims into darkness and oblivion. The murders were not acts of frenzied passion. They were financial transactions, executed with surgical precision. When he was done with a victim like Emmeline Sigrand, when her assets were signed over and her value exhausted, Holmes would initiate the final sequence. Perhaps he drugged her tea, or lured her into a storage vault under a pretense. Once the heavy steel-lined door was sealed, the fate of the victim was absolute. The struggle would be muffled by the asbestos lining, the dying breaths observed through the peephole. The bodies would then be handled with the detached efficiency of a doctor processing a specimen. They would be slid down one of the hidden chutes and into the basement. This was where the full extent of Holmes's psychopathy became clear. He would not just destroy the bodies, he would dissect them. He enjoyed the process, studying the musculature and bone structure, perhaps reliving the medical school days of grave robbing, only now he was the supplier. He would clean the skeletons and, in a horrifying twist of commerce, sell them to local medical colleges, profiting twice, first from the victim's money, then from their mortal remains. The disappearance of Emmeline Sigrand was particularly gruesome. After her murder in late 1892, a watchman reported seeing a mysterious man, clearly Holmes, hauling a heavy trunk onto a carriage late one night. Later, fragments of her clothes and a piece of her jewelry would be found in the kiln's ashes, providing one of the few tangible links between Holmes and the nameless victims of the castle. For Minnie Williams, her end came in 1893. She and her sister Nanny Williams were eliminated, likely for their considerable property and for knowing too much about the doctor's increasingly reckless affairs. Holmes often sold his victims' property and then, using his forgery skills, sold the property of the victims he had just killed to other victims. The entire operation was a self-sustaining cycle of charm, murder, and high-stakes fraud. The White City continued to dazzle. The crowds roared with excitement, and in the shadow of the fair, the castle silently consumed its prey, hidden in plain sight. The unraveling thread, a partnership in crime. By the close of the World's Fair in October 1893, Holmes had amassed a significant, if blood-soaked, fortune. But his luck, like the plaster facade of the White City, was beginning to crack. His financial schemes were too numerous, his debts too vast, and the number of missing persons too high to maintain his facade indefinitely. He needed to disappear, and he needed one last grand scam to finance his permanent flight. This is where Benjamin Pitezel came in. Pitezel was an earnest, often pathetic man who served as Holmes's long-suffering assistant, right-hand man, and eventually his accomplice in fraud. Ben Pitezel was everything Holmes was not: loyal, clumsy, and possessing a deep, tragic sense of family duty. Holmes devised an insurance fraud scheme that was audacious, even by his standards. The plan was simple. Ben Pitezel would take out a $10,000 life insurance policy payable to his wife, Carrie. Holmes would procure a cadaver, easy enough for him, use his medical knowledge to mutilate the body beyond recognition, and stage a laboratory explosion. Ben would collect his insurance money, pay Holmes a fee, and both men would go their separate ways. Ben Pitezel, desperate for money to support his wife and 5 children, reluctantly agreed. Holmes, always paranoid and unwilling to trust even a loyal associate, had a far more sinister plan. In the summer of 1894, while in Philadelphia, Holmes murdered Ben Pitezel. He didn't use a cadaver. He used Pitezel himself. He chloroformed the man and then set a flammable substance alight to make the death look like the planned lab accident. Holmes, pretending to be a fellow physician named Benton T. Lyman, identified the body, collected the $10,000 policy, and began his ultimate betrayal. Pitezel's death marked a critical shift. Holmes was no longer just killing isolated individuals, he was eliminating an entire family structure, and his crimes were about to cross state lines, bringing him to the attention of a far more relentless foe, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Storytelling. The Chase Across America. Having collected the insurance money, Holmes knew he was a wanted man. He had to vanish, but he couldn't resist one last, horrifying act of malice. He decided to take complete control of the Peitzel family. He convinced the grieving wife, Carrie Peitzel, that Ben was still alive and hiding in London, and that he, the benevolent Dr. Holmes, would deliver her and her children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, to their father. Carrie, exhausted and distraught, handed over 3 of her children to Holmes's care. What followed was a chilling, desperate journey across the American Midwest and Canada. Holmes essentially played a cat-and-mouse game with Mrs. Peitzel, keeping her and the 2 remaining children, who were with her mother, constantly moving and in the dark, while he traveled with Alice, Nellie, and Howard, all under different assumed names, through cities like Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Toronto. Holmes was simultaneously running 2 different family operations. He had Carrie and 2 children in one location, and the 3 older children, whom he intended to kill, in another. The children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, were intelligent and starting to ask too many questions about their papa. They became a liability. First, in Indianapolis, Holmes rented a house and murdered the 2 girls, Alice and Nellie. He locked them in a large trunk, then drilled a hole in the lid, inserting a rubber hose connected to a gas line, a portable version of his castle vaults. He murdered them by gas and then buried their bodies in the basement. Next, he took the youngest child, Howard, to a rental house in Toronto. After poisoning the boy, he dismembered his body and burned the remains in a stove. The meticulous disposal of the Peitzel children was his undoing. Holmes' movements were now crisscrossing North America, leaving a breadcrumb trail of lies, forged documents, and missing people. The Pinkertons' net and the final capture. The Peitzel insurance fraud had drawn the attention of the Fidelity Mutual Life Association, who suspected foul play. They hired the renowned Pinkerton Detective Agency to investigate. The lead investigator, Frank Geyer, was a dogged, methodical man whose primary focus was not the $10,000 insurance payout, but the safe return of the 3 missing Peitzel children. Geyer was the antithesis of Holmes. Where Holmes was flashy, Geyer was quiet. Where Holmes used lies, Geyer relied on facts. Geyer began systematically retracing Holmes's steps across the country, piecing together the doctor's various aliases and rental agreements. The trail, though complex, was not cold. Geyer's breakthrough came when he found the rental house in Indianapolis and, following a tip from a neighborhood boy, dug up the basement. The discovery of the 2 small skeletons of Alice and Nellie Peitzel was the irrefutable evidence that changed the entire scope of the investigation. Holmes was no longer just a swindler. He was a child killer. The nation was horrified. Now a national fugitive, Holmes was tracked to Boston, where he was finally apprehended on November 17, 1894, due to an unrelated incident involving the theft of a horse. His arrest brought an end to the chaotic chase. In a twist of supreme arrogance, Holmes had also promised to split the insurance money with Marion Hedgepeth, an incarcerated train robber he had met in a Missouri jail, in exchange for legal advice. When Holmes double-crossed him, Hedgepeth, eager for revenge and a reduction in his own sentence, betrayed Holmes to the authorities, providing the final, necessary piece of evidence about the insurance scheme. The great architect of annihilation was now reduced to a common prisoner, his mask finally ripped away. The confessions and the end. The ghost of the castle. Holmes was taken to Philadelphia to stand trial for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. It was a spectacular trial that captivated the nation, the first true media circus surrounding a serial killer. The press dubbed him the Beast of Chicago and the Torture Doctor. As the focus of the investigation turned back to Chicago, the castle came under intense scrutiny. The building itself had been seized after Holmes defaulted on loan payments. Local police and reporters descended on the property, and the stories they uncovered confirmed the most horrific rumors. The police, armed with the vague, fragmented accounts of the former contractors, began to piece together the building's internal mechanisms. They found the soundproof vaults, the hidden gas lines, the trapdoors, and the secret, bricked-up rooms. The sheer evil of the design was a testament to the methodical nature of the killer. In the basement, they found more than just the residue of the Pitezel children. They found disarticulated human bones, fragments of jewelry, charred women's clothing, and enough evidence to suggest that the castle had been a continuous, active murder factory for years. The discovery of the murder castle was a defining moment in American true crime history. It was physical proof that the darkness of Jack the Ripper, a fear that had gripped the world only a few years earlier, was not just a European horror, but a terrifying reality thriving within America's new, gleaming cities. The Last Lie and the Legacy. Convicted for the murder of Ben Pitezel, H. Holmes was sentenced to death by hanging. In the months leading up to his execution, Holmes played one final grand confidence trick. He sold his life story and confession to the Hearst newspaper syndicate for a staggering $10,000. In this confession, he claimed responsibility for 27 murders, providing gruesome, detailed accounts of his methods. However, many of the people he claimed to have killed were later discovered to be very much alive. Even on the scaffold, Holmes was incapable of telling the truth, always seeking to control the narrative, to inflate his importance, and to keep the public guessing. His final confession was likely his last great act of forgery, a psychological manipulation designed to make his end as memorable as his life. The true number of his victims remains one of the enduring mysteries of his case. While the confirmed number tied directly to Holmes is 9, historians estimate the total could be anywhere from 20 to over 200, given the sheer number of disappearances in Chicago during the fair and the evidence found in the castle. On May 7, 1896, H. Holmes was executed by hanging at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. Even in death, he tried to control his image, requesting that his coffin be encased in concrete and buried 10 feet deep, fearing that his body would be dug up and dissected, perhaps a final, ironic fear from the man who had done the same to so many others. The castle, the ultimate monument to his depravity, met a fitting end. Shortly after his execution, a fire of suspicious origin gutted the upper floors, fueled by the public's desire to erase the physical reminder of the horror. The building was eventually demolished in 1938. The tragic true story of H. Holmes is the story of America's turn-of-the-century transition. He was a product of the Gilded Age, a time when ambition and appearances trumped morality. His crimes revealed a terrifying vulnerability inherent in the modern, anonymous city, forcing Americans to confront the horrifying reality that a monster could walk among them, masked not by a costume, but by a polite smile and the promise of a bright future. His ghost remains in the folklore, a constant, chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest evils are committed by the people who seem the most trustworthy.
The Hound of Justice and the Trail of Bones. The Pinkerton Man. The disappearance of Benjamin Pitezel was meant to be the perfect crime, an insurance scam that yielded a substantial $10,000 payoff, a respectable burial for a nameless cadaver, and a clear path for Holmes to dissolve into the American frontier. But Holmes had made two fatal errors. He killed the actual policyholder, and he stole the man's children. This brought him into direct conflict with Frank Geyer, a stout, unassuming detective from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, hired by the Fidelity Mutual Life Association to investigate the suspiciously quick payout. Geyer was not a man of flash or dramatic flair, but a creature of relentless, patient methodology. He was a hound of justice in a time when police work was often sloppy and localized. Pinkertons, however, crossed state lines and pursued criminals with the diligence of a private nationwide police force. Geyer cared little for Holmes's flamboyant persona. He cared only for the facts. His investigation began with the corpse found in Philadelphia. It was identified as Pitezel, or so the insurance company thought. Geyer began interviewing anyone connected to the victim and the policy, including the man who had identified the body, Dr. Benton T. Lyman, H.H. Holmes. Geyer quickly sensed the layers of deceit. He observed the peculiar lack of grief from Lyman, the convenient disappearance of the deceased's family, and the convoluted paperwork. He discovered that the money, upon payout, had been channeled through various accounts and forged checks, all eventually traced back to the elusive doctor. Geyer's quiet persistence led him to the distraught widow, Carrie Pitezel, whom Holmes had abandoned in a state of confused terror. It was from Carrie that Geyer learned the heartbreaking truth. Holmes had taken her three oldest children, Alice, 15, Nellie, 11, and Howard, 8, promising to reunite them with their supposedly hiding father in England. The three children, bright and trusting, were now lost on the open road with a monster. For Geyer, the financial crime became a desperate rescue mission. He swore he would not rest until the children were found, dead or alive. The Traveling Monster. The trail Holmes left behind was deliberately chaotic, designed to confuse pursuers. He moved at a breakneck pace through Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, New York, and finally into Canada, all while juggling the two halves of the Pitezel family. Holmes' psychological manipulation of the children was calculated and cruel. He convinced Alice and Nellie that their father was a thief in hiding, which is why they had to travel under false names, first as the Howard family, then as the Adams family. The children, raised in a Methodist home, were frightened and obedient. In reality, Holmes was parading his latest bigamous wife, Georgiana Yoke, across the country, often bringing the children along. Georgiana, a naive and trusting woman, believed Holmes's lies about being a wealthy inventor traveling on urgent business. The sight of Holmes traveling with a beautiful young woman and three children who called him uncle was a perfect, innocuous cover. The tension of this journey was almost unbearable. They were constantly on the move, sleeping in different hotels, always a step ahead of the telegraph wires and the Pinkerton network that was tightening around the doctor. It was during this harrowing flight that the children became too much of a liability. Alice, the eldest, was reaching an age of suspicion. Nellie had a noticeable limp due to a clubfoot, a characteristic that made her too memorable. And young Howard, being a boy, was observant and prone to asking questions. Holmes could not risk being exposed. The House of the Dead Children. Geyer, using train schedules, hotel registries, and the memory of clerks, meticulously tracked the Pitezel family through Indianapolis. He eventually found a peculiar small cottage that Holmes had rented under the name of D.S.R. Hatch. The neighborhood seemed quiet and unremarkable, but Geyer's detective's intuition told him this was where the journey ended for some of the children. He questioned the landlord and the neighbors, learning that Mr. Hatch had left abruptly, and that the cellar of the small house had a freshly dug mound of earth covered by a thin layer of lime and cement. On the third day of searching, the Indiana authorities and Geyer began to excavate the basement. The scene was grim. They uncovered 2 shallow graves. The remains were those of Alice and Nellie Peitzel. The older girl, Alice, was found with her hands folded neatly across her chest, a small preserved handkerchief covering her face. Forensic evidence later indicated they had been gassed to death by chloroform, the same method Holmes used in his castle vaults, a silent, terrorizing end. The discovery sent shockwaves across the nation. The newspapers ran banner headlines, "Child Murder." The discovery confirmed the depravity of H. Holmes. He was no longer just a clever swindler. He was a monster who killed children for money. Frank Geyer, momentarily broken by the gruesome find, dedicated himself to finding the final child.
The final horrific clue. The discovery of Alice and Nellie gave Geyer a clear path. He knew Holmes was traveling north. The detective pushed on, tracking Holmes' aliases into Canada, focusing on the route to Toronto. It was in Toronto that Geyer found the last, most horrifying clue. Holmes had rented another house here, again leaving a telltale stench and strange burn marks. Geyer discovered a stovepipe that had been twisted and removed. When the police searched the chimney and stove, they found fragments of bone, teeth, and a few scraps of bloodied child's clothing. It was the remains of 8-year-old Howard Peitzel. Holmes had dismembered the boy and attempted to cremate him in the small stove, a desperate, clumsy echo of the efficiency of his Chicago kiln. Howard, it was later theorized, was poisoned, then mutilated and burned. Geyer was now armed with the bodies of the 3 children and the full confession of the Peitzel fraud from Marion Hedgepeth. The net had become unbreakable. Holmes, oblivious to the fact that his trail of corpses had been discovered, was apprehended shortly after this, not in Toronto, but in Boston, having fled south. He was tracked down by a Pinkerton agent named John S. Dodge, who found him having an evening stroll with his latest, unsuspecting bride, Georgiana Yoke. When the warrant for his arrest was read, citing a warrant for horse theft, Holmes, forever the arrogant doctor, corrected the officer with a smirk. "I believe I'm wanted for the murder of Ben Peitzel." He didn't know the warrant was already being updated with the charges of the 3 Peitzel children. The game, at last, was over. The trial and the final curtain. The beast in the dock. The trial of H. Holmes for the murder of Benjamin Peitzel in Philadelphia in October 1895 was a spectacle unmatched in its day. The courtroom was packed with reporters, society figures, and morbidly curious onlookers. Holmes, ever the narcissist, saw his trial not as a fight for his life, but as a grand performance. He dismissed his own lawyers and chose to represent himself for a portion of the proceedings. He cross-examined witnesses with a cool, condescending air, attempting to pick apart the prosecution's arguments with legal jargon and theatrical displays of intellect. However, the evidence was overwhelming. Frank Geyer presented the painstaking trail of aliases, forgeries, and the gruesome evidence of the children's remains. Carrie Peitzel, the heartbroken mother, testified about Holmes's manipulation, her sorrowful account sealing the jury's hatred for the defendant. The final nail in his coffin was the testimony of Marion Hedgepeth, who recounted Holmes's original insurance plot, revealing the killer's cold-blooded motive. Holmes's defense hinged on a sophisticated argument.
He claimed he was merely the victim of a conspiracy hatched by the Pytezel family, who he alleged had killed Ben themselves to collect the insurance money. It was a labyrinth of lies designed to confuse the simple facts. The jury was unconvinced. In a matter of hours, they returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. Chapter 16: An Execution and a Legacy of Fear. Following his conviction and facing the gallows, H. Holmes finally decided to sell his story to the press. For a fee of $10,000, he delivered a lengthy, sprawling document that detailed his life and claimed responsibility for 27 murders scattered across several states and Canada. This final act was pure Holmes, a monstrous exaggeration designed to secure a place in history. Many of the people he named were quickly proven to be alive, and his motive for the confession was purely financial and egocentric. But it cemented his status as America's greatest monster. On May 7, 1896, at Moyamensing Prison, H. Holmes stepped onto the gallows. He showed little emotion, his calm only briefly disrupted when he expressed a fear that his body would be exhumed and dissected, displaying a final, twisted lack of irony. The rope tightened, and the architect of annihilation was dead. The impact of H. Holmes's crimes was profound and lasting. He became the dark legend of the American boom years, forever linking the dazzling promise of the World's Fair, the White City, with the horror of the Murder Castle. He was the first true American serial killer to be documented, pursued, and chronicled on a national scale. His story establishing the template for the media obsession with the psychopathic mind that would follow for a century. The tale of H. Holmes remains a tragic, true story of how ambition, when detached from morality and empowered by anonymity, can create a private, terrifying kingdom of murder hidden in plain sight at the very heart of American progress.